I want to welcome everyone this morning and hope everyone's morning is going well and that each of you are feeling well. See, I think it was Howard asked if we're going to be able to finish Judges by the end of the semester. Not at the rate that we're going. And so I've had a decision to make. Basically, I can skim over the material real quickly and we can get through with the material that way. Or I can continue going over the material in a more detailed study and we won't get through. I figured I would do the second of those, continue on as we have been going and go as far as we can with it. And then I realize that you will all be scarred for life, that your spirituality will be destroyed. And I'm saying that, of course, tongue-in-cheek, but I felt like it might be better to do it that way than just skimming over it and not really dealing with the text as much. If y'all would rather do it the other way, then you might let me know, but I think it's a better study going through it in detail. We had gotten down to the 7th chapter of Judges. Here we have the victory of Gideon's 300. And in the first 8 verses, we have the reduction of the army. And let me go ahead, and I had started pasting something else onto the chat room and forgot this aspect, so let me go ahead and chapter 7, the victory of Gideon's 300, and in the first 8 verses we have the reduction of the army. I mentioned this, I believe, last week as we began this and just introduced it. I want us to mention it again, and then we'll go into the 7th chapter. But in this, we are going to see 3 things regarding God's care for the Israelites and also the type of men God needed in this regard. The first is that God wanted men who had confidence in Him. This is, and as we see the reduction of the army, God saying, in effect, I want you to have confidence in me. I want you to trust in me, not in yourself. And then, anytime difficulties should arise, they, instead of trying to handle it on their own, they would be able to continue on with their confidence in God. If difficulties in warfare should arise and they were trusting in themselves, they might flee from battle, but if they were having confidence in God, then they would continue to be able to stand. A second thing God wanted was men who were courageous. That's why in the very first thing that He set forth, those who are afraid, go home. Fearful, return home. Likewise today, God needs men who have confidence in Him, who are courageous, who are not afraid to do, to declare, to defend God's will. Remember in Paul's statement to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 13, that he encourages them to watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit ye like men, be strong. So here's these four aspects that he mentions, and then in the next verse, verse 14, let all things be done with charity or with love. So five things, but in that 13th verse, there's the four admonitions and commands, all of them military terms, to be courageous, in effect. And that's what God needs today. He does not need men who are fearful. Third thing that we want to see in this is that God needs men who are careful, who are alert, who are watchful. This is the basis for the water test. And we'll see this as we go through there, but God in effect says those who are not watchful, who are not alert and careful in the way in which they drink the water, we don't need them. We need people who are going to be watchful, who are going to remain alert at all times. And we certainly should see the need for that today in the fact that we have false teachers all around us. And we have to be watchful. We have to always be careful and be on the alert, because Satan, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. And so, yes, we have to be careful. We have to be watchful at all times. God did not need those individuals who were not going to be on alert, who are not being watchful at all times. If they let down their guard, God knew that those are the individuals who would be defeated in battle. And likewise today, when we let down our guard, we're liable to be defeated by Satan. Now then, as we begin in verse 1, Gideon, who is Jerubbaal, and he is called Jerubbaal more than he is Gideon, especially as we get on down into our next judge, Abimelech. Gideon then is always called Jerubbaal, but Jerubbaal very simply means one who contends or contended with Baal. Well, he sets forth that there's the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. So here the invaders were in the valley of Jezreel, in effect, is what this is. And Gideon had assembled his army south of the Midianites, so the Midianites north of them. Verse 2, God gives them Gideon confidence in saying that God is going to deliver the Israelites into the hands of the Midianites. But he says, there's too many of you to do it. Too many Israelites for me, God says, to deliver the hand of the Midianites into your hands. At that time, there were 32,000 men. That's 32,000 Israelites to the 135,000 Midianites. That presents a ratio of 4.2 Midianites to 1 Israelite. If you're going into battle and you're looking at these two forces, 32,000 Israelites, 135,000 Midianites, you would say that the odds for the Midianites at 4.2 to 1 is pretty good odds, and that the Midianites, in all probability, would win the battle, would win the war. And because generally we think that the more people that is on one side, the greater the chance for victory. Especially if you go into hand-to-hand combat, if you have 4 against 1, the 4, it would seemingly would be a whole lot easier for the 4 to win than the 1 to win. We think that there's a power in numbers. And if you take God out of the picture, that probably is going to be the case. There is going to be power in numbers along that line. But with God in the picture, that's a whole different story then. And we're going to see that here as well. But how many times do we hear of individuals today even in the church, think, why, there's power in numbers. Think of the statements that we hear so many times in relationship to, there's a great activity over here in this congregation. It doesn't matter whether they are being truthful to God's Word or not, as long as there are so-called conversions, then that's all that matters. Hey, they must be doing something right. Look at all the people that are going there. Look at all the number that they're converting. Doesn't matter if they're converting them to the truth or not. It just, a lot of people are going there. There's a lot of activity. There's power in numbers, as is the argument. If that's the case, then by far the greatest group that we have in our society today are those that believe in God but don't attend services any place, in any religious group. Well, that must be right then. So let's close down all of the church buildings and just totally quit worshiping God altogether if there's power in numbers. Well, that philosophy is a false philosophy. But also, when we look at this situation, God says there's too many because He knows what's going to happen. That the people would think eventually we did this instead of realizing that God did this. And thus, they would be filled with pride. You remember what Solomon wrote in Proverbs 16 and verse 18, that pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. That instead of trusting in God as they are supposed to, they would be trusting in themselves. Solomon said in Proverbs 3 and verse 6, that in all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. Instead of acknowledging God, if they started thinking we were able to defeat the Midianites by our own power and by our own strength, they would have been acknowledging themselves, trusting in themselves, instead of acknowledging God or trusting in Him. Also, there would be that temptation that we just mentioned about thinking that numbers, the greater numbers, mean right. And so because we had greater numbers and we had greater physical power, that means that we were right. And that simply is not the case. Enrig wrote concerning this that Judges 7 and verse 2 is one of the most important verses in the Bible for understanding God's principles of spiritual warfare. God is not interested in simply giving His people victory. He is concerned with teaching us trust. In fact, if our victories make us self-reliant, they are ultimately more disastrous than defeat. And while it didn't come across in the EPOP, that word with teaching us trust, he emphasized the word trust there. Put it in italics. I don't know if y'all came across this. It went around the internet recently was sent out by a lot of different people. I received several copies of it, talking about it's the soldier that gives us all of these things, and while I in no way want to denigrate those who served in the armed forces today, in reality, that email was wrong. I don't have the freedom that I have today because of the soldier. I have it because of God. It's not the power of the American people or the armaments that we have in our society today that gave us victories, whether it be World War I or World War II or whatever victory we want to talk about in battles that we've had. It's not that gave us the victory. It's God who gives us the victory. As long as we are right with God, God will be with us, and doesn't matter the numbers or the power that we might have or that someone else might have. As long as God is on our side, then we'll win. And when God turns his back against us, turns his back on the American people, if you will, then it doesn't matter how many people, how many armaments that we might have, we will be defeated. We'll be destroyed. Why? Not because of the soldier, not because whether it be our soldiers or someone else's soldiers, not because we have more bombs or smarter bombs than someone else. It will be because God determined that's what he wants. And I think we need to remember that. And I'm not saying, and I'm not trying to get into a discussion as to whether or not the Christians should enter into battle. That's beside the point. Doesn't make a bit of difference as far as what I'm talking about this morning. I think we need to continually remember it's God that determines victory or defeat, not numbers, not power, or anything else. Well, that's the key that's being set forth here in Judges 7. It's not the power of the person or the army, not the number that's going to bring about the victory. It's whether or not we trust in God. And I'm afraid in our nation today, our victories have caused us, instead of trusting in God, to trust in self. And I think that is a concern that we need to be concerned with. Well, verse 3, thus, God tells the Midianites, or the Israelites, all of you who are afraid, go home. Well, that doesn't sound, again, too good for the Israelites, because now then, out of that 32,000 that they start with, you now have 10,000. 22,000 people go home. Again, I wonder how many of these 22,000 went home simply because they saw the numbers. And they saw the power of the army that they would be facing. They've got 135,000 people over here. And we have this few 32,000. That, from a physical standpoint, again, would cause an individual to be fearful. And from that standpoint, we certainly would not denigrate them in the fear that they would be having in going to battle against this many. So 22,000 leave, and now then they have 10,000 remaining. Well, that brings down the odds a whole lot more. You have 13.5 to 1 now ratio. You started out with 4.2 to 1. Now then you have 13.5 to 1. Ratio really has gone down now. Surely, from a physical standpoint, we would think 10,000 to 135,000, surely God doesn't want us to cut it down any more than that. He'll be pleased with that. But verse 4, God says there's still too many. So let's get rid of some more. And so he, in effect, says to Gideon, whoever I say should go to war, those are the ones who need to go, and send all of the rest of them home. So verse 5, we're going to have a water test. And this test is a test basically to separate them into two groups. The first group, those who lap water like a dog, and the other group, those who get down on their knees to drink water. Lapping water like a dog would be, in effect, getting down probably on your knees, or maybe on one knee, and then reaching the hand down and bringing the hand up to the mouth, cupping the water, bringing the water up with your hand to your mouth, and drinking then the water out of the hand. In that way, by bringing it up right into that, they could still watch and see what's going on. That is the aspect of they would remain alert. However, those individuals who got down onto probably their hands and knees and would put their face down into the water and then drink the water directly, that would be sucking the water into the mouth, which would be really the common way of drinking the water. Those individuals, if someone came up, they wouldn't have any idea that someone was there, because the only thing that they could see would be the water, and their face would be in the water. The ones who, though, were bringing the water up to their mouth with their hand, they would be ready to defend themselves. In fact, they could bring it up, if they were right-handed, bring the water up with the left hand and still have their right hand on their sword. And if anyone came close, they were there, ready to fight. So you have basically a test in this of those who are going to continue to be alert and watchful as opposed to those who are careless. Well, the number that lapped like a dog, bringing the water up with their hand to their mouth, were 300. The ones who put their face into the water, or their mouth into the water, and sucked the water directly into their mouth was 9,700. So God says, verse 6, I'm going to deliver you by the 300 men who lapped the water like a dog. This makes the ratio 450 Midianites to 1 Israelite. Now, from a physical standpoint, that is not good odds. No one, I don't think, would argue 450 to 1 is really that good of odds. Again, we go back to that which Enreg said, that God is trying to teach them trust in Him. That's the main aspect. Howard mentions you could say that the 9,700 were foolish and careless, not been concerned with what confronted them, and that's true. They were careless. I mean, you got an enemy out here who's ready to pounce on you, very possibly, looking for an opening, and there's the aspect of individuals who are just careless with their life. So they're sent home. Verse 7, we see those God saying, I'm going to deliver you by the 300 men, and the 9,700 return home. But in this, we also see God's care for and involvement in the lives of His children. If you and I were devising a plan to deliver Israel, it would not be done in this way. If you were devising, and you were a military general devising a plan of attack against an enemy, you would not try to eliminate the majority of your soldiers to where you have especially odds 450 to 1. No way. Again, man, we would think greater need for greater numbers. But we need to learn, when God is on our side, the number of people with us is not important. With God on our side, we will be victorious. Well, verse 8, and Gideon sends home the 9,700 men. Next, we have in verses 9 through 14, the Midianites' dream. The Midianites' dream in verses 9 through 14. Verse 9, it is interesting how God strengthens and encourages Gideon. We should remember that Gideon has been a little bit, and is a little bit, nervous through all of this as to whether or not God really will deliver Israel by my hands or not. Is God really with me? And so here is another way in which God strengthens and encourages Gideon, and how that God has promised, I'll deliver the Midianites into your hand. And it's another way, thus, in which he prepares him for the battle that night. Verse 10, it's interesting when God is not rebuking Gideon for his fear. Notice, if thou fear to go down, then go thou with Pharaoh, thy servant, down to the host. He's telling him, you go down to the camp of Midianites, and I'm going to send you a message that way. And he says, if you're afraid, it would seem like almost, don't be afraid. But instead of a rebuke Gideon for his fear, it is more along the line of strengthening and encouraging him in his faith, and allowing and giving time for Gideon to grow and develop into the leader that he needs to be. I think a lot of times, many times, we, in dealing with those who are young Christians who might not have matured as they should, and we deal with them as if they were or should be a mature Christian, that they should know a lot of things. It's interesting, Jesus, the master teacher, spending 3.5 years about with his apostles, and yet, as he comes to the end of his life, in John the 16th chapter, would tell them, I have many things to say unto you, but you can't bear them yet. Yet here's the master teacher spending 3.5 years with his disciples, and there's still things that he would like to tell them, and they cannot take it yet. There is a time of development, and maybe we sometimes expect too much of people in the developing process that they go through. And we need to show patience a lot of times with individuals as they grow and develop. Now, that's not an excuse for someone who's been a member of the church for decades and yet is still a spiritual babe. Those individuals are not growing and developing. They are abnormal in their Christianity. They have digressed, and they're not doing what God wants them to do. So there is, though, that time that God expects for development within the Christian. And we need to realize that as well. Well, verse 11, God tells him, go down into the camp of the Midianites, and you can hear what they are going to say. And upon hearing what they say, Gideon is going to be encouraged to go into the battle against the Midianites. And again, in verse 12, he mentions the aspect that the Midianites and the Amalekites and all of the children of East lay along the valley. Like grasshoppers for multitude, he's emphasizing the much greater number of these enemies than of the 300 Israelites. Verse 13 then, Gideon goes down into the camp and he hears this Midianite soldier relating a dream to his friend. It seems obvious to me, at least, that this dream must have come from God and was a message to Gideon. God was, in a providential way, bringing this dream to him. God had arranged through telling Gideon, you go down, you hear this message. And God provides the dream. God provides and makes it where Gideon is there to hear the dream and the interpretation of it. Well, the dream is a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian and hit a tent. The tent basically was the camp of the Midianites, the Amalekites, and these individuals. It tumbles down, striking a tent and striking fear into the Midianites. Verse 14, the interpretation of that dream then is that Gideon and his forces would destroy the Midianites. After hearing this dream and the interpretation that's given, Gideon is strengthened by this that he has heard, and he is now ready to go into battle. Tanner wrote that the irony is stunning. Hearing the promise directly from the Lord did not convince Gideon, but hearing it from the Midianite soldier did. And that is and does stand as rather odd. There is an irony that is there. Here's God promising, I'm going to be with you, I'm going to give them into your hands, and there's still that fear. God tells him, go down, listen to what you're going to hear from the Midianites, and that convinces Gideon that he's going to win the battle. I'm not sure that it was not that hearing the message directly from the Lord did not convince Gideon, but it is the fact that Gideon still needed stronger encouragement than hearing it directly from the Lord, and hearing the Midianite soldier did do that. It's not that Gideon did not believe God, and that's the aspect I want to stay away from in that. It's just that he needed greater strengthening and encouragement than apparently what he received from God. Well, now then, the next section, verses 15 through 25, Gideon's defeat of the Midianites. And I want us to notice four things in relationship to the conquering of the enemy that we are going to see here. The first of those we've already started seeing, and that is the charity of God. Verse 9 and other verses really also emphasize this. God has delivered the Midianites into their hands. It was a gift which God gave them. And we've talked a lot about this as we went through Joshua, that it was God's gift. Same thing here. It was God's gift. It was His grace. Did that alleviate them of doing anything? Of course not. They had to respond properly to that charity or that grace of God. Otherwise, the Midianites would not have been delivered into their hand. But we do see in that the charity or the love, the grace of God. A second thing that we see in this is the capable leadership of Gideon, verses 16 through verse 18. And we'll go through these and talk more about them as we go through the text, but want to introduce them here. The 300 men are divided into three groups and separated around the enemy. He tells them, and here's leadership: you do exactly as I do. You look at me, you watch me, and what you see me doing, you do. Capable leadership involves directing the people, telling them what to do, and that's what Gideon did. He told them what to do, but then he also, capable leadership involves setting the right example for them, a demonstration of what needs to be done. And thus Gideon saying, you do what I do. He explained what we're going to do. Then he says, you watch me and you simply follow my lead. And there's the idea of leadership. You follow what I'm doing, my lead. Can't help but mention congregations of the Lord's church today need capable leaders. Paul encouraged the elders of the church at Ephesus when he's talking to them at Miletus in Acts the 20th chapter. You be good leaders. Take heed, verse 28, to yourselves and to the flock over which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers. You feed the church of God. In 1 Peter 5, verses 1 through 4, Peter discusses the fact that elders were to take the oversight thereof. It was not to be done out of constraint, but willingly. It was not to be done for filthy lucre's sake, but of a ready mind. And then he makes a statement not as being lords over the flock, but being examples to the flock. Here's an illustration of that which Peter is saying. Gideon was being an example to his men. You do as I do. He explains it. There's leadership. He's taking the oversight. Here's what we're going to do. But now then, you watch me and you do what I do. Example to his men. That's what true leadership is all about. Sad to say, we have far too few leaders in the church of our Lord today. We have a lot of people who are in the role of elders, but very simply, even though they're in the role of elders, they're not the type of leaders that God really wants. They're not being examples to the flock. They're not making the decisions and taking the oversight and then saying, you follow me as I am doing these things. A lot of them just want to act as a board of directors who are sitting there and you do this, you do that, and they just sit there and do nothing. That's not leadership. So in this, though, you see a good illustration of leadership, the capable leadership of Gideon. A third thing that we see is the cooperation of God's people, verses 19 through 22. There is the need for organization and for plans. God had set forth, here's what we're going to do. Gideon tells the people, here's what we're going to do. There's organization, there's plan. He divides them into three groups to surround the people. There's the plans. He gives each of them the things which they need. There's plans that were involved in it. But all of that organization, all of the plans would have been useless if the people, the 300 on this occasion, had not carried out those plans. Unless the people carry out the organization and the plans that have been made, nothing will get done. And in this time, or on this occasion, Gideon's army certainly cooperated with Gideon in doing what he said. What if you had the situation, one person over here did it, but no one else did it? Well, obviously, the whole plan would have backfired and it would have failed, would have been worthless. They had to work together and all doing the same thing at the same time in the same way. Well, likewise, there's need for cooperation of God's people in the church today in doing the work of God. In 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 9, and then in 1 Corinthians 12, we see these principles set forth for us. In 3 and verse 9, we see that aspect of here's Paul and Apollos. We're workers together with God. That one is watering, one is planting, but God gives the increase. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul likens the church to a body. And even as the body, all of the parts have to be working together in order to carry out its accomplishment, that purpose and that plan. So the church has to be working together, all of it working together in order to carry out the plans that God has set forth for the church today. Can you imagine, and it's even hard for us to imagine this, but try to imagine an individual who has one foot trying to walk one way over here, and then his other foot is trying to walk the other way. He's trying to go in opposite directions at the same time. It's an impossibility because the body cannot work that way. What happens when part of the body does not work even in walking? There's an awkwardness to it. It does not accomplish what needs to be done. Watch someone as they are running a race, and all parts of the body have to be in tune in order for him to run effectively. What if somebody entered a race and he tried to keep his arms perfectly still and down by his side as he ran? He's not going to win the race in that situation. He's not going to run effectively. In congregations where there's confusion, there's bickering, there's complaining, you're going to have a congregation that's not going to be successful, that is, in fact, going to destroy itself. Unless there's a willingness to be submissive to the leadership of the elders of the church, it's going to hinder the work of the church. That work of the church simply will not get done. Now, of course, we cannot cooperate in those areas that are contrary to God's Word, but in those areas where there is that option, where we have liberty in accomplishing and doing those things that are expedient in accomplishing the will of God, then we need to be working together, cooperating in getting the job done. Cooperation of God's people. Fourth thing that we see in this is the commitment of God's people, verse 21. When they get to the place where they need to be and where they're going to do all of this, there's then a commitment to carry out the work. We're going to work together, but there's a commitment there. A commitment on the part of every man and not just some of them. What if today within the church we got every member of the church working together and having a commitment on each individual's part, each member of the congregation's part, to do what God wants them to do in their life? What we could accomplish is probably beyond our imagination if we could do that. what we find so many times, and it's been stated in different ways, some have put it that 90% of the work is done by 10% of the people. Others have put it 95 and 5, others 80 and 20. However you want to put it as far as odds or ratio, doesn't make any difference. All of those expresses the idea that the majority of the congregation does not do any work, or does so little work that it's practically nil. That the majority of the work is done by a very select few individuals. Now then, if you could get 100% of the people working just like you can that upper, let's say 5%, if it's 95 and 5, what would the church accomplish? It's amazing to think of. But there was a commitment on their part. We will do this. We will accomplish this. We're going to carry out the plans. And every individual was involved in doing that. Now then, that we've gone through this very briefly likened to that, let's go back to verse 15 as we begin this section, the defeat of the Midianites. And remember these 4 points as we go through this, and we won't really go in and deal with it again, but since we've discussed it a little bit, but keep that in the back of your mind, these 4 points as we go through this. Verse 15, after hearing the interpretation of this dream, Gideon worshiped God and returned to his army. Plus, in verse 15, after he has been strengthened, he now strengthens his soldiers. You remember Jesus and Peter, and Peter says, I'll not deny you, and Jesus tells him, you'll deny me 3 times before the cock crows twice. And so Peter does, but then Jesus tells him, once you're restored, once you're strengthened, strengthen the brethren. Well, that's the way it is with Gideon here. He was strengthened. Now then he goes to his soldiers, his 300, and he strengthens them. Verse 16, he divides his 300 men into 3 companies. Those 3 companies were to encircle the enemy, although in all probability the 300 did not encircle the enemy totally, probably on 3 sides. He gave each of them a trumpet, which would have been a ram's horn, pitchers, and a lamp or a candle, which they would put in the pitcher. These 3 groups, dividing it in this excuse me, dividing it, the 300 men into 3 groups in this way would make it appear as if there were a lot more than just 300. So it would make it appear as if there were a larger number. Verse 17, we see in particular here his leadership. In telling his men, you watch me and you do what I do. Verse 18, they were to blow the trumpets at the same time. And if you can imagine 300 trumpets being blown at the same time, that would have produced a great sound, a large noise. Then they were to shout with a great shout of the sword of God and of Gideon. Again, all of them blowing a trumpet at the same time, all of them shouting this great shout, would give the appearance to the Midianites of a great number of soldiers, and it's going to cause confusion in the camp of the Midianites. So verse 19, he does this, he situates his men, and in the beginning of the middle watch would be about midnight. And thus it would have been that most of them would have been asleep and would have been awakened in this by all of this and by the confusion of the events. Well, our time is up and we need to have a break at this time, and then we'll come back and continue here.